editor of the Physics Review D, which is a prestigious journal in the high energy and particle physics that is run by the American Physical Society. So today's talk is the general talk, and the topic of the talk is the physical review or tour. So please, Ansar.
Thanks, Jamil. It's a great pleasure to be back at Qaid-e-Azam University. I have very fond memories, and walking around the campus, I'm transported back to my childhood and the visits to my father's office and my uncle's office. And when I think back to my relationship to the Physical Review, I remember walking into their office and seeing this wall of these austere green volumes, and I was to discover that those were the volumes of the Physical Review, so I can't recall a time when the Physical Review was not a part of my life, in some sort of in the background at least. So it's strange to be now part of that in a different setting altogether. So so I just wanted to say a few words about my own time there. I've been there almost 10 years now. In January it'll be exactly 10 years. Before I started, the world of journals was a mysterious world. You sent your paper in, and something happened, and you heard back from them. Hopefully at the end of the process, the paper would be published. But it wasn't really clear what was going on in the background. So I thought it would be interesting to to give you a little bit of an idea of what goes on, the machinations, behind this, black box. Anyway, so I'm going to keep my talk fairly short, and I was hoping maybe we could have a discussion at the end, we can explore in a more deep way if you have any questions about the Physical Review and publishing in general, I'd be happy to continue the discussion afterwards. So let me just start out by saying a few very general things about the Physical Review. So the Physical Review is a society journal. It's not privately owned. So it's run by physicists and for physicists, and it's not for profit. And it's a truly international journal, as I'll show you in a little while. Some of the sort of demographic information about authors, referees, and editors as well. So even though it's associated with the American Physical Society, it's actually is a truly international journal. So let me just give you a brief sort of overview of the journals that we have at the moment, and give you an idea of the timeline as well. And you can see the Physical Review dates back to 1893, and next year will mark the 125th anniversary of the journal. And you can also see here that the APS becomes involved with the Physical Review somewhat late. 1913, 20 years later. Let's see if we can figure this out. Okay, so in the beginning, the Physical Review was one journal, and then at various stages it split up into these smaller journals because it became somewhat unwieldy, and also because, so the Physical Review itself publishes research that's new, so new results, but at a certain point there's this new journal, the RMP Reviews of Modern Physics, that was started, which give you sort of these review articles. So it was a somewhat different scope. And then you can see the PRL started here in 1958. Soon after I joined the APS, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of PRL. And then later in 1970, the Physical Review was split into PRA, B, and A, B, C, and D. A is the atomic physics and quantum mechanics. And I guess initially it had some other topics as well, which were later in 1993 split into a new journal, PRE. PRB is condensed matter, PRC is nuclear physics, PRD is particle physics, relativity and gravitational physics. Gravitational physics and cosmology. And that's the journal that I work for. And then there are some smaller journals. This is Accelerators and Beams, and this is an education journal. Physics is not a regular journal in the sense that it doesn't receive new papers that are reviewed and published. Rather, it highlights papers that are published in the physical review journals. And then we have these new, very new journals, the PR Applied, which is a journal of applied physics, PR Fluids, which just started last year on fluid mechanics, and this is an extremely recent development, Physical Review Materials, which is on material physics. Some of this material, I guess, was published in PRB, and now it's split off, but it's a much more expanded.
So PRX?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. Good point. I forgot to mention PRX. So PRX was an experiment. It is an experiment, and it's an open access journal which has developed into a very high impact journal, and it's probably along with PRL. Those are the two journals that are the most selective. We can talk more about that. And this is our new editor-in-chief, Michael Tennyson. And anyway.
So if it is open access journal, then authors have to pay for it, or?
Yes, they do. So it's a somewhat unusual combination in that it's a highly selective journal that's open access. Okay. So any questions about the journals?
So what are the topics for PRX?
PRX is everything, same as PRL. That's a good point. The others have a more sort of narrower scope, whereas these two are completely general. And RMP is also completely general. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the sort of international character of the physical review, I'm just going to show you 3 slides on demographics. So this is a slide which shows you about where we receive papers from. And so this is you can see that the United States and Canada only represent 24% of the papers that we receive. Europe is a big chunk, but we also get a fairly large amount from other parts of the world, particularly China. And the Indian subcontinent isn't doing too badly either. So it's really, we receive papers from all over the world. And I have to say that the proportion that we receive from other parts of the world that are not the United States and Europe is increasing every year. We get more and more papers. And also, this slide here shows you where the editors are from. You can see I'm from here. And this is tells you about, so before the earlier slide was submissions, and then these are papers that are actually published, that are accepted for publication. You can see it's a similar sort of pie chart. Our referees also come from all over the world. We're working on increasing the number of referees that we have from, non-European and North America. But you can see that the whole world is represented here. Okay. Any questions about that? About the demographics?
Why such a disparity? Because lots of good papers are published from China publishes a lot of good research. Why the same isn't represented in demographics of the editors?
Oh, I see. We do have, well, partly it's because we're located in the United States, and it's not really, and we have to select from a fairly small group of people. So, but we do have editors from China. For instance, Ling Miao is the editor of PRX. She's from China. And we have similarly other editors from China. Like PRA has one, and yeah.
There's
Yeah.
one more
Yes,
question.
of course.
If you see the demography,
Yeah.
so the papers submitted from China, subcontinent, they're a large percentage, but the published is very small.
It's it's let's have a look. So let's go
Yeah,
back.
I also wanted to ask about that. The
Yeah.
ratio of published
Submitted is
submitted paper.
Yes.
Where is it the largest? Is it the US, Europe, or?
Yeah, I think that really represents sort of the quality of papers that we receive, but it's not so bad, I think. So let's go back a little bit. So, for instance, from the Indian subcontinent, it's 6% of the total submissions, but then the published is 3%.
In Europe, for example, it increases. The
Yes.
published paper is 40%
Yes.
were submitted.
I agree. Yeah.
Other areas that.
Yeah, I mean, right. Part of it is self-selection. Okay, so one of the things that you find is that people who are experienced, they'll carefully choose the journal that they send it to. Like, for instance, if you have a very important result, if you're experienced, you'll know that you should send it to PRL. If you're not so experienced, you might send a result that's not so, important to PRL, in which case it's likely to be rejected. So there's an element of that too, of like experience and just kind of knowing the culture of the journals. So it's not necessarily a reflection of anything insidious or But I think to really answer the question more deeply, I think one would have to study it more deeply too, which I've not done. Any other questions? Okay. So, so I want to talk next about the review process itself. So basically, so let me just go over. So initially, when we get a new paper, it's looked at by the editors, and they make a sort of a first sort of selection, whether to continue with peer review or reject on the basis of the information that they have at hand. I'll show you some statistics later on for the different journals, but I'll just say that for Physical Review D, that very rarely happens that we reject a paper just based on the editor's opinion. There have to be very clear reasons, but there are. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So
What's
that's
the
a-
pre-screening rate, like without sending it to?
yeah, I'll show you some statistics on that in just a moment. I have a slide on it. Okay, so right. So so the next step is then if the paper is not immediately rejected, it goes to peer review. That is to say, it's sent to a referee, and then there are of course various possibilities. One is that it's rejected based on that peer review, and another is acceptance. That's of course very broadly speaking, but this cycle it will this peer review can be it's a back and forth. So if a referee submits a report, that goes to the editor, and then the editor makes that decision, and to either continue or to reject or to accept. There are different sort of possibilities. Now, if the paper, so any questions about that? Sorry, I didn't do a very good job of explaining the peer review process. I just have it as a box. But the peer review involves sending it to the referee sends a report, and then the report is sent. So basically, the report tells you whether or not the referee thinks that it should be revised, rejected, or accepted. So if the referee requires revisions, then we'll send it back to the author, and then the author attempts to address the referee's concerns, sends it back to us, and then we either continue with the review with some other referee or the same referee, or either accept or reject, depending on the referee's recommendation. I mean, the referee may, for instance, say that make these revisions and then accept the paper. It doesn't need to be reviewed further. So that's a possibility where the editor can then make the decision to accept. So sometimes when we reject a paper, that's always the case, that the authors are not very happy about it. So they can either accept that rejection or they can appeal to the board. So we have an editorial board of prominent physicists, and if the rejection is appealed, they're sent the complete file of the review. So they basically get all the referee reports, and the referees are identified, and they get the author's response to the various referee reports, including the final one that we used to reject the paper. So the board member then reviews the paper in light of the review that's already taken place, and it's usually based on whether or not the editors did the right thing, selected the right referees, and so on. It's usually not as another review. You know what I mean? Like, it's not that the board member is reviewing the paper from scratch. They're basically looking at they're reviewing it in light of the review that's already taken place. So and one of the things that's peculiar about this part of the review is that the board members are identified. So in the earlier peer review here, this is all anonymous. So the referee is not identified. But when you appeal to the board board member signs the report, and so you know who looked at it. And of course, since we have many, we have board members that come from very many different fields, so you have to select the correct subfield in order to go to the.
Yeah, but the board members are identified, but the referee still.
The referees are not identified. Yes, they remain anonymous. Yes. Okay.
But
So
the board may include also the referees as well, or not? They are excluded.
The board member, sorry?
The reviewers, the referees, they could also be the members of that board at the final.
No, usually when there's somebody who's on the board, we usually do not consult them as anonymous referees. And if we do, in some rare cases we do, in that case they're not allowed to be the board member who is dealing with the appeal, because that would not be fair. Right. Yeah. Right.
So the board, it's a permanent board, I mean? Or
No, it's not. There's a 3-year term.
Oh, but for 3 years they are running. It's
Yeah.
not for every paper you form a board for.
Oh no. It's a 3-year term, and then we have and there are these overlapping terms. So every year we appoint members to the board, and they have a 3-year term, and there's this kind of staggered list of board members. Okay, so then
So the
yes.
job of the board is either to accept it or set it to adjudication or something like that? Or?
Yeah, so they're the adjudicators. So basically there are essentially 3 types of things that can happen. One is that they recommend, they uphold the rejection that we already made, or they can suggest that we accept the paper so that they overrule the referees. And then a third possibility is they can recommend further review, and they'll say, send it to so-and-so and let's see what they say. So they might not be completely satisfied with what the referees had said. So in that case, we'll continue the anonymous review, but the board member will then be kind of overlooking the whole that process.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Suppose a paper is rejected by a reviewer
Yes.
and then it is accepted by the board. So do you inform the
Yes.
reviewer?
Yes, that's actually one of the things that I found really very interesting about working for the physical review is that everything is sort of revealed to everybody involved. So if you're overruled, you get a letter with sort of the what happened after they reviewed it. So so you'll see all the correspondence, and that also happens if the paper is accepted. So with just normal review too. Like at the end of it, all the referees get the full file of the sort of back and forth between the authors and the referees. That is not the case with other journals. As a referee, I've found that let's say recommended rejection of a paper, and then later I find that the paper is accepted, but I have no idea why it was accepted. Whereas with the physical review, we always reveal that the sort of the correspondence that took place after the referee reviewed it. Any other questions?
Does it happen sometimes that you have to, after this appeal or sometimes you remove a referee from your board of referees, based on referees, and
okay.
you find that he is biased enough that he should be removed or something?
So what can happen is that we'll put a note. So we have a database of referees, and we can put in various notes. Okay, so for instance, one note is, if the person is, we find this person to be not very trustworthy, we might put in a note saying that this person's not very trustworthy, and that kind of thing. There are some cases where, for instance, there's some rivalry going on between a referee and a particular group. In which case, once that's identified, that is to say, usually the authors tell us, that they have this rivalry going on. Please don't send my paper to this person. Then we'll put a note there. Don't send any papers from this group to this person. And so we do respect that kind of thing because we want the review to be as objective as we can manage.
What prevents you from having a double-blind process, not identifying the authors also?
Well, okay, so there are people who've been thinking about this, and my main problem with this is the following: that most research is now put on the archive, right? So you can easily identify who the person is. Unless if they don't put it on the archive, then of course you can maintain a certain level of anonymity for the author. But it's usually not that difficult to figure out who it is, at least in theoretical physics, where the group's so small and so on. I think there are people who are considering, experimenting with it, and I know there are some groups at some journals that have experimented with that. I think maybe more in biology. I'm not sure though.
There are few material science journals.
Oh, okay.
So they are going for the double blind.
I see. Yeah. I think that it's sort of it is difficult to actually maintain the anonymity of the authors. I think, but it's definitely worth thinking about. It's sometimes even difficult to maintain the anonymity of the referees because, sometimes we have referees who are like, please cite these papers, and there's one person in common with all the papers, and that's the referee. Doesn't require a genius to figure out who the referee is.
Do you have any statistics on how many appeals accepted or rejected?
I did not dig that up, but I could if you're interested. But I have to say that there aren't that many appeals. It's a relatively rare thing. Okay, there's one final thing that you can do if you're, after your paper's been rejected by the board, which is to appeal to the editor-in-chief. And that is a purely procedural thing. The editor-in-chief will not review the paper, or even, but just make sure that the editors didn't do anything that was, procedurally forbidden. So that's the role of this last resort. Okay, so I want to say a few things about our publication criteria, like what kinds of things are we looking for. So the main thing is, so the first, of course, is that it should fall within the scope of the journal. So for instance, Physical Review D, we don't publish any reviews, so if you send us a review, we'll reject it. So that's based on scope. Purely, if you send us a paper on biological physics or biophysics, we'll reject it because it doesn't fall within that purview. So that's a very easy thing to deal with. So that's usually done just by the editors, but sometimes we send it out for review because it's not completely clear if it falls within the purview. For instance, sometimes we'll get papers that really belong properly in an instrumentation journal. So it'll come from a particle physics experiment group, but it's not really new physics. It has more to do with its instrumentation. But sometimes when it's not completely clear whether it belongs in PRD or not, we'll send it out for review and ask the referee to determine whether it's PRD is appropriate. So we may use review to actually determine this. So as far as once it's sent out for review, the kinds of things that we ask the referees to determine is whether it has new material that it's reporting. So this element of novelty that's crucial. And of course, new material isn't necessarily significant, and that's why we this is the second thing that we look for, is that it's a significant new result. If for instance, if you have an already established theory, let's say, and you just tweak some parameters, that's not necessarily a significant result. It's just, it might be new in that nobody's done it before, but it would not qualify necessarily as being significant. Unless, of course, that particular tweaking has some significance in itself, and which is then elaborated. So that's the second thing. And then, of course, there are other criteria. Like sometimes people send us either extremely long things with huge reviews of known material, or an excessively short, terse paper that really should be elaborated more. So we'll ask the referees to look into this, whether the paper should be made shorter or expanded. Of course, we also look into we ask referees to determine that it's not misleading and that it's clear, and so there's no sort of ambiguities there that may detract from its usefulness. Okay, any questions about the publication criteria? Of course, yes.
So what is the appropriate length for this journal?
Right. So we don't have any length requirements at PRD, except for the rapid section. Okay. So the rapid communication section has a 4-page limit, but otherwise there's no length limits. It could be as long as you like, and we've published very long papers in the past. There are other journals that do have a length requirement. PRL in particular has a length requirement, which is also, I think, 4 pages. There on some rare occasions, PRL will waive the length requirement. But anyway, so with PRD and the other PRA, B, C, D, X, there are no length requirements except for these particular sections, the rapid communication section.
Is it necessary to cite APS journals in the references?
No, absolutely not. You can cite whatever you think is appropriate. Yeah. No.
That is an unwritten rule. Unwritten rule, kind of. So.
That you can cite or not cite.
It's just a comment.
Yeah. No. I never look at that when I'm acting as an editor. I mean, I do look at the references to see, what sort of subfield that it's sort of developing, rather than looking at which journal it was published in. These references were published in. Those are not something that concern me. Although I have to say, like, if the reference list is all PRBs and PRCs, I might think that maybe the subject. But other than that, and I mentioned the PRB and PRC, but it could be any condensed matter or nuclear physics journal that might make me think that this might fall outside of the purview of PRD. But but I don't really worry about whether those references were published in Phys Rev. Okay.
There's an impression that the editors look at the references to find an appropriate reviewer for
Yes.
it. So is that,
Yeah, that's certainly one of the things I look at. Yeah, and that editors generally look at, because that gives you an idea of where it fits into the landscape of the published material, and so it's a natural place to look for referees. But it's not just enough to sort of randomly pick somebody from the list of authors. You have to look at where exactly what exactly those papers are. So. Yeah, but that's certainly a useful thing to do. Okay, so let me just say a few things about. So this is rejection. This is average time. Okay, right. So basically, so what happens is that in this review process, there's a little bit of time that. What do I do to? Oh, anyway. Okay, cool. So basically, when a manuscript is submitted to us, it spends a little bit of time at the office with us, at the APS office. It spends some time with the authors and some time with the referees. And so the thing is that what we try to keep to a minimum is the amount of time that it spends at the office. So basically, so you can see with PRD, we're doing particularly well compared to our colleagues. So what that means is that when we receive a paper, we pretty much immediately send it out for review, and when we receive reports, we immediately try to send them out to authors and so on. And so that's one part of the process that we can control completely. The amount of time that we have it. The other stuff, not so much. I mean, the authors can take their time with the manuscript. So you can see that over here. The green part is the number of days that is with the authors, and then there's the amount of time with the referees, and that's also something we can't control. We of course send reminders and so on, but we do have to rely on referees to do the right thing.
so authors, you mean when they are sent for revision? Huh?
Yes, that's right.
So for the preparation of response on the other side, is there a limit on time?
Is there a limit? No, actually, with physical review, there is no limit. So you can submit it like a year later, 2 years later, and we'll still, continue the review. Of course, the problem is that if you do take a while, what happens is that there's there's the issue of whether it's still current. So if there have been developments since then. And you resubmit it like 5 years later. I mean, we have to ask the referees, is this still significant? Should the references be updated and so on, that kind of thing. Let's see what's going on here. So this is okay. So let's see. Yeah, sorry. This is for 2016. So I think it's the same slide. Sorry about that. I thought I had a slide on rejection without review, but I can talk about it a little bit. Maybe now's a good time to do it because we're still talking about the review process. So, as I was saying, with different journals have different policies, or different sort of modes of operation. They're not policies in the sense that they're not written anywhere. We generally tend to have very similar policies, but there's different cultures at the different journals, even though we're the physical review family. So let me talk a little bit about physical review D. So as I was saying earlier, so one reason for rejection without review is scope. So if it doesn't fit into the sort of subject areas that we cover, then we will reject the paper. But other than that, it's very hard to get your paper rejected without review. So if you question special relativity, that's one way to get your paper rejected. If you think that, there's some mistake that Einstein made that nobody's discovered, in the 100 and some odd years that we've had the theory, then we'll reject it because the evidence is that is in favor of the theory. And in order for us to take this paper seriously, you have to do something to kind of say that everybody else was wrong and you're right. You're not going to find a mathematical error there, even though it's surprising the number of people who think that they've found something wrong with the theory. So basically, if it doesn't question sort of things that are completely well established, we'll send it out for review. This is not the case for all of our journals. Some of them do have a criteria that the editors look at, and then they determine whether or not they're going to send it out for review. And I wish I had those numbers here. I'm sorry, I thought I'd included a slide. But you'll see that the numbers for PR B and some of the other journals are a little higher. So, for instance, PRA may reject if it's too mathematical. That's one of the things that they look at, which is not something we do. And PRB has other sort of, to some degree, subjective criteria that the editors use to determine whether or not they're going to send it out for review.
This bar for PRC is very interesting. Why are the paper with editor for such a long time, over 1 month?
That's actually, I think I don't know for sure, but I can hazard a guess. Okay, so with PRD, we have basically in-house editors, whereas some of the other journals, they have what are called associate editors who are at other institutions, and so basically there's this. The in-house editors, they'll take care of some of the sort of the back and forth between the authors and referees, but they have to also consult with the associate editors who are handling the manuscript. So the associate editor will determine who the referees are and so on, and will make various sort of contributions. But most of the sort of day-to-day work is done by the in-house editors. For those journals like PRC, there's a little bit of lag time because the associate editor may be busy with other things that are going on, at their physics department or wherever they're working, and so that can add to the lag time making a decision. But for the journals that have in-house editors like PRD, it's a very short period of time.
Excuse me, sir?
Yes.
But if the author or editor have stored your data and rewrite your paper and publish in your own journal, then how we can claim that this is my paper? Or
If one of us, one of the editors?
how we can claim that this is my paper and he can store my paper and rewrite it?
Okay, so just as a very broad thing, like if somebody else takes your data or whatever and publishes it, then we do have, you can bring it to our attention. Okay, so if it is actually one of the editors, you could write to one of the other editors, I suppose, and just tell them that this is what happened. I mean, what happens is if you send it to the journal, that information will be, sent out to all the editors. So if it's one particular person, who's responsible for this, that they'll be, the others will know about it. But in general, we do have issues of ethics that come up, including claims that somebody has published results that were really rightfully belong to them. It's not the easiest thing for us to determine. If it's a clear case of plagiarism, then we do have the paper is rejected, or if it's already been published, it's withdrawn. And the people who repeatedly do it, they're barred from submitting to us for a certain period of time. So there are ethical issues that we take them very seriously.
And sometimes reviewers also take them in either they copy or they take ideas idea from the paper, and they publish their own paper, not appropriate for this journal, and he publishes his own paper on the same topic, and then
Yes. Yeah, that can happen. Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot we can do about it. I mean, referees sometimes take their time or whatever, and we don't know what their motivations are. But there are some cases where it's pretty clear, and you can kind of guess what's going on, and we do try to take note of that.
So, what do you think if someone puts his paper on archive?
Yeah.
So that thing will block this kind of possibility or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think putting the papers on the archive is a very good way of establishing priority. So if it's there, then you know that this person did it, first, But of course, if you don't put your paper there and then you send it out for review, and then the referee, steals your idea or whatever, and then publishes their paper, then you can't really establish priority in that way unless the journal then comes forward and says, this was submitted to us, Yeah, but so I think it's in general it's a good idea to submit to the archive.
So, do you consider JHAP people as your competitors in case of PRD?
Yeah.
If one paper gets rejected from your journal and
Yes.
got accepted in JHAP,
That happens.
Vice versa.
That happens. Yes.
That happens.
I don't really view them as rivals, frankly. I think there's enough room for all of us to kind of coexist.
But
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right that we cover these areas that we cover do overlap, and and to that extent, we are competitors, but friendly competitors. Yeah, we're not trying to undermine each other. Yeah.
Regarding your comment that rejecting straight away if something, let's say the paper is talking about maybe that something can move faster than the speed of light or relativity or whatever. Just something I was thinking about, if somebody in 1920s writes a paper and he is talking about gravitational lensing, or he is talking about, say, general relativity or even special relativity, how you will look to that paper. Mr. X is writing, forgetting about it, he is Einstein or someone else, but he is challenging the ideas existing
Right.
at that time.
Yeah, we don't. So my point wasn't that we don't accept challenges to to sort of physics that's relatively new or whatever. I just mean that there's that things that are completely well established, and you claim to have shown that it's wrong. Like, I mean, at this point. Finding a mathematical error in special relativity is just not, it's not possible. It's just, and we know that it's the sort of the favorite hobby of some amateur physicists to kind of poke holes into this theory. So that's why I use that particular example. But certainly you're welcome to send us papers that challenge some ideas that have a certain degree of acceptance in the community. That's for sure.
Yeah, but that guy is writing to you talking about the gravitational force is not actually a force. So how you will look into that?
Okay, so right, so there are cases where it's simplest just to send it out to a referee. So if it's something where it's getting a little complicated, where you would actually have to review the paper in order to reject it, we'll send it out for review. It's only in like very clear-cut cases that where we'll reject, without review. So we'll send out. I mean, we regularly receive papers that I'm pretty certain will not be accepted, but we'll send it out for review.
Is it possible for these journals to go to open access without any author charges, publication charges, or it's not
Yes.
economically viable?
Okay, so yes to both those questions. So first of all, I think the archive is a great way of making everything open access. So people submit to the archive, and it's anybody can download the paper. I will talk a little bit about what's happening in particle physics, where it is going towards open access because of certain developments. So I'll mention that in just a little bit. But it is true that
Open access with refereeing.
yes,
Yeah, peer review.
yes,
Included.
yes, without any payment on the part of the author, right? So that is a development that's taking place. I'll talk about it in just a couple of slides later when I talk about sort of new developments. But I do want to say that our model is a subscription-based model, and we do need money to come in, so that does pose a little bit of it does pose a problem for us, and I will talk about like one attempt that's about to take place now, which is open access without the authors paying, and where there's no subscription, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But let me just mention a few things. That we also have some mechanisms of highlighting papers. So this thing is something that we introduced just a few years ago, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where we select certain papers that are accepted for publication in PRD, and we mark them as editor's suggestion. And this is accompanied by like a short 3-line sort of summary or whatever, or explaining why it's important. So that's one mechanism of highlighting. And so every week, the PRD editors get together, and somebody will nominate a paper, and we'll decide whether or not to put this marker there. And it's usually something that's of somewhat broader interest. It's not like some technical development. Usually something that's can be of interest to a larger group of people. Then, in addition to that, soon after I joined the APS in 2008, we started this journal, Physics, and as I put journal in quotes here because it doesn't, as I mentioned earlier, they don't, you can't submit a paper to it. They basically highlight papers that are published in other Phys Rev journals. And so there are 2 ways in which they highlight. One is a synopsis, so it's like a brief summary of what the paper is about. And then the other thing is a longer piece that's written by a physicist who's an expert in that particular subfield. It's a longer piece called a viewpoint. And then finally there's they can also highlight using what's called a focus article, which is meant for a much broader audience, and brings together a bunch of different papers and talks about sort of the developments and more generally. And then we also sometimes have important. Yes. Go ahead.
The viewpoint is an invited.
Yes, it's invited. Right. And then we also sometimes mark important anniversaries with collections of physical review articles that are, that were published in the past, and then they become freely available. We did that with general relativity. I believe, 2015. And then I'll mention another one that's coming up. So. Let me just show you the web page of Physics. So this is what it looks like, and so you can see that there's a viewpoint here that's written by 1 or 2 authors. Here it's 2 authors. Then you have this is a selection of these recent viewpoints. And then you have synopses, which are sort of these brief summaries, and then you have focus pieces, and then those are the different areas that they cover. Anyway, so that's one thing that's, I guess at this point it's like 10 years old, so it's not that new, but it's relatively new. And then, just to kind of advertise, the Physical Review, as I mentioned, has a very long history, and we've had the good fortune to publish some really important papers, and that continues to this day. And so I just wanted to just highlight some of the sort of Nobel Prize winning papers that we've, the recent Nobel Prizes that were based on papers published in the Physical Review. And the most recent, of course, is this year's Nobel Prize in gravitational wave physics. And that paper, the initial observation of gravitational waves was published in PRL, this one right here. And then subsequently there have been several other important observations by LIGO that we published. I think this is my last slide. I just wanted to mention a few things that are about to happen. So this agreement that was initiated, I believe, by CERN, called the Scope 3 Agreement, basically is exactly about this question that you raised, Kashif, which is about making the Physical Review open access, and so without it costing the authors anything. And so basically what happens is that with this agreement, which the APS just recently signed, the Physical Review will get a certain amount of money basically to compensate for the lowering of the subscription price, if we remove PRD from the APS package. So they'll cover the subscription cost. But that, of course, requires that Scope 3 continues to be funded. So there's that possibility of both having open access without it costing the authors or the reader anything. But that requires intervention from some other body, which in this case is the Scope 3 thing. So starting in January of this year, anything that's published within high energy physics, okay, so that means that within about 60% of the Physical Review D will be covered by Scope 3. So those papers, after they're published, they will be accessible, downloadable by anybody in the world. Yeah.
Some journals have already, started this. And
yes.
One of the conditions of the agreement is, some authors find it very strange that they insist that the paper must be submitted to archive before it is considered.
That's
some authors find it very, very strange.
Yes, that is true.
Is the case with PRD
yes.
also?
It will be, yes. That it has to be submitted to the archive, yes. And it is strange. But,
okay, so editors also find it strange. Authors are finding it strange.
Yeah. Right, because what I mean is that the reason why I say it's strange is that what we're trying to do is to make the idea behind Scope 3 is to make papers that are published that are within high energy physics open access. The subject area should not be determined by whether or not they're submitted to the archive. So it's not, but that is currently the way in which they determine whether or not it's high energy physics, if it has a HEP archive ID. Yeah. Anyway, so the sorry, I can't believe I wrote 1918 here. I meant 2018. That's next year. But this will mark the 125th anniversary of the Physical Review, and so there'll be celebrations throughout the year at the various conferences. We'll have material. And one of the things is that we're going to be making important papers that the Physical Review has published over the years available for people to download and read. And it's going to be accompanied by this beautiful timeline poster with these sort of papers kind of prominently displayed and with their significance indicated. I was part of this process of finding papers and writing synopses for papers in high energy physics, we were faced with this strange dilemma. We had to find like 50 papers altogether, and we had to basically, there were many Nobel Prize winning papers that we couldn't include on that list because there were just so many important papers over the years that so we had to make this selection, which is a happy position to be in, but it was a little weird to not be able to include all the Nobel Prize winning papers in that list. And next year will be the 120th anniversary of the American Physical Society, and I believe we're going to have a joint March and April meeting in 2019. And I again wrote 1919. I don't know why. Yeah. So this was my last slide. And it was kind of an abrupt end, but I thought to open up for discussion if there are any questions.
Thank you. Sultan, please. Okay.
Can you tell me about the to minimize the plagiarism?
To minimize it?
Minimize plagiarism.
Okay, so you mean what do we do to minimize plagiarism? Okay, so usually we have to have some kind of indication that it's plagiarized, right? So there are some indicators that we might notice ourselves, or there might be or the history of the author, or the referee may tell us, that there's some there are parts of this that are plagiarized. But we do have ways in which we check. So we use Authenticate, which is a program that checks to see whether parts of the manuscript have been taken from other published sources or from the internet somewhere, and we check to see that there's no plagiarism there. And if there is, it depends. We'll go back to the author and tell them that's not acceptable, and go from there.
What's the best way when you want to publish a paper? So what's if we are newer?
Yeah.
So what's the best way to minimize this one?
Okay, right, and it's a good question. I think, and I think that what happens sometimes is that people who want to express themselves well, they think, okay, well, I'm just going to take some introductory material from this other place or whatever. But that's really not the ethical thing to do. The thing to do is to try to express yourself as well as you can, using your own words, and just make sure that there's no copying, because that's somebody else's work. They put a lot of effort into it, and and it will also save you a lot of trouble later. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes.
I have two questions. One is, what is the reason for, this physical review is very famous, either reviewing criteria, or on the other hand, it is also available worldwide in most of physics departments. In your opinion, what is the reason for the uniqueness of this journal? And the second question is, as compared to physics, chemistry journals, for example, American Chemical Society, Physical Society is still following the old styles. It is not implementing the innovation, for example. It is not making them interactive or something like that as compared to other journals. What is the reason?
Okay, so let me take that second question first. I think we are trying to introduce certain innovations, and it depends on what you mean by more interactive. We do have now this thing called supplemental materials, which you can submit with the paper, which isn't published, as part of the paper. But what I mean is, if you go to the page for the paper, you can click on it, and you can include movies or whatever that you think would be a material that would be useful or enhance the value of the paper, and that will be stored on that website. And you can people send Mathematica code, they send all kinds of things that you can then access through the website. So we do have interactive features, and if there's anything in particular that you think we should be doing, I would be interested in your suggestions. As far as the reputation of the Physical Review is concerned, I think partly it has to do with its history. It's been around for a very long time. It's been sort of we've published many of the key papers over the years, so that reputation is there. But we of course try to maintain that the quality of the journal by making sure that we publish good papers I think one thing that's very important to me, and it's important to all of us as editors, is to be extremely fair. So we get papers from from all over the world, and we try to treat everybody the same. And as I was showing you the demographics, not only the authors but the referees themselves come from all over the world, and we continue to try to add to the referee database so that there's that the whole world is represented. One thing another thing that I'll say is that since we are a society journal, we're not a for-profit journal. We're not. We can do things that for-profit journals cannot do. We try to publish papers that are, that report new and significant physics, but we don't worry about how many times is this paper going to be cited, or that kind of thing. There's kind of more superficial things that drive a lot of sort of the more commercial publishers.
Lucas.
You guys receive any papers like from weird ideas, like from flat earth believers, static earth believers, and if you reject their paper, obviously, do you tell them any mechanism? Because they met up last year in some conference and they said scientific community is not ready to listen to us. And things like that. So what's the mechanism to reject such papers? Tell them something?
Right. Okay, so basically in situations like that, we just send a very plain rejection. We don't try to argue with them too much because, what can you say at this point? The evidence is so overwhelming. I think it's really the onus is on them to convince us that they're right, because the consensus is that they're wrong. We don't really try to argue with them too much.
Yes, again.
Can you let me know that how do you choose your permanent referees? Is there any special procedure?
There are basically two types of things that we do. Like one is that if I see somebody who's been submitting to us, or whose papers I encounter, I might add them to the referee database if I think that they have the kind of expertise that would be useful for us. Another thing is that you can also volunteer as a referee. If you do volunteer as a referee, we do have some vetting, so we'll look at the sort of potential referees' publication record and see what kind of expertise they have, and based on that, we'll decide whether or not to add them. Sometimes people very early in their careers, like as graduate students, they might volunteer, and we'll just say, why don't you wait a little bit and then come back, and then maybe we'll add you. So there are mechanisms through which you can volunteer as a referee, and I have to admit that some of part of the process of finding referees is somewhat random in that it depends on whether or not I notice somebody who I think might be good for this. So I may miss a lot of other people who would be equally good, but I just so there's that randomness there, and volunteering can sometimes help with that. Yeah.
Okay, so again about this Scope 3 agreement.
Yes.
So don't you think they should change this requirement, and they should insist, the authors submit it to archive when and if it is accepted for publication? Currently they ask you to submit it before consideration.
Yeah.
So if it is accepted, then okay, they should submit it.
I have to say that right now the Scope 3 agreement is not completely clear to me, exactly at what stage you have to submit it to the archive.
General File Energy Physics insists that they should submit it before.
So I think as I understand it right now, so it may depend on the journal. So if it is if it's submitted before it's accepted, that might very well make it qualify for Scope 3. Right. So it doesn't have to necessarily be submitted before it's submitted to us. as long as it's before it's accepted, and of course, certainly before it's published, because you can't retroactively make it. Yeah.
So why the ratio of subcontinent is very low as compared to China and America to publish the paper? Is there any discrimination between the Pakistani peoples of China that they cannot publish, they can reject it?
It's the literacy rate.
Sorry, but, yeah. Okay, I don't know why that is the case, but I will say that we try not to be prejudiced. As I was saying, like we try to treat every paper that's sent to us as as this honest piece of work that needs to be.
So how we can improve this ratio?
By writing good papers.
Secondly, if a person cannot write his name in Urdu, how can he submit paper to PID? So there are not many people who can write their name in Urdu.
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So one of the projects that the APS took on over 10 years ago is to have people from China, Korea, and Japan. They can submit their names as in their native script, and then that is there, and that's one of the problems I think with names from some of those countries is that they all once they're transcribed into English or to the Latin alphabet, they seem to they look the same, but in their native scripts they look quite different. So we're hoping that this will help us find unique combinations of names and people, which is not always easy with certain names.
When Europhysics journals were made the first time, so there was an observation which was submitted in Europe that American journals, including Physical Review, takes much longer to publish European papers as compared to American papers. Is it still?
I don't know. I've never heard that before, but
I was there, so I remember that.
Yeah.
This was a very good argument why we are making European physics journals, and so this was a big argument that okay, still our papers are published in take much longer time.
I see. In the old days, I can imagine it was sending the paper by mail could take a while, but that's no longer.
Internet came by that time.
Yeah, I see. But I have not heard that before. I'll look into it. I don't think it's because of any sort of prejudice against Europeans. As far as I know. Yeah.
Any other question? Okay, if no more, then I have a question.
Oh.
When you send the papers to two referees, for example,
yes.
One writes a report in a favor of the paper with minor changes, and the other completely rejects it. And then you have to send a paper to the third referee.
Yes.
And there's a problem in that,
Yeah.
You send both the reports to the third referee, and he has to choose one of the opinions. Why not as an independent referee? He has to act as a jury, not as an independent referee. So, do you think it's fair with the
I do think it's actually fair, because the problem is that so the third referee is supposed to adjudicate, right? I mean, there are two conflicting opinions there, and that person has to decide, who's right. By the way, they don't have to necessarily side with either of those referees. They could say that they're both wrong, and there's my third opinion. Because I mean, life isn't yes, no. There's also because the referees are also, when they say accept, they have to give reasons, and when they say reject, they also have to give reasons. And it may be that the adjudicating referee recommends acceptance or rejection, but may completely disagree with the two earlier authors. But the point is that when they're adjudicating, when you're trying to, they have to look at those other things, because they're going to overrule one of them, right? And in order for us to have a fair system, we have to be able to tell the referee why we overruled them. And so we need, otherwise it would just be like, it would just become this random thing where you just propagate, and whoever's the last person, gets to decide. And they have to, in order to be able to overrule. Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
I had another question. I'm sorry, I forgot to ask it earlier.
So what if you feel that the referee hasn't, properly read the review? Because it happened to us.
Yes.
I mean, the paper was accepted, but he had made some comments in the archived version of process. I mean, that doesn't really include, kind of like a re-review of the paper.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that? Or
Yeah.
what can the author do?
Right. So I mean, so it's exactly what you're saying, that the authors have to inform the editors that this referee hasn't read their paper properly, and you make that argument, and then we'll based on that decide. It may be that it's an honest mistake on the part of the referee. I mean, that does happen. That they don't want to download the paper from the server. They want to download it from the archive because it's a lot easier. They don't have to log in or whatever. And if it's an honest mistake like that, the referees will say, okay, sorry, my mistake. I'll look at the newer version of the paper or the version that was submitted. So that's. Of course, if you make it the case convincingly and the referee is still not swayed, like we can go to a new referee. I have to say that we do. If the author is asked for a new referee, we'll usually go to a new referee, unless they're really, unless it's such a one-sided review from more than one person that there's no point to go to another person.
If a paper is kept rejected by editor, and if the author insists to kindly send this paper to review for review, do you consider?
Yeah, we do consider it. So it depends on the situation. I mean, as I was saying, using the same example, if it's like special relativity and there's something against it, we won't. But if it's other things, we will send it out for review. And again, the culture of the journal is very important here. So I'm talking mainly about PRD because I know that culture the best. But there are other journals that have more other criteria which they may use to continue to maintain their rejection. So I can't speak for that. But the PRDs are.
Okay, if no more questions, then let's thank Ansar once again. Thank you very much.